So yes, I'm here representing University Geoscience UK. So we're effectively the trade association, if you like, of the university geology departments across the UK. And I'm going to give what I hope is a representative view of what we see as being some of the challenges. There's a growing feeling amongst our membership that change is needed, but we're not quite sure what that change should be. And so we're really reaching out to you to try and ask you to help us shape that future. So I'm going to commit a cardinal sin here. Probably for the first time in my career, I'm going to give a talk where there are no slides of rocks or structures or field geologists or anything like that. So it is a little bit texty and bullet pointy, for which I apologise. So the academic perspective, well, we've all got an academic perspective. We've all been through a university, be it in this country or be it in another country. And that perspective may be quite recent, and Joachim will say something about that, I'm sure, in the next talk. Or it could be a little bit more distant, and I won't dwell on that. And what I wanted to do was sort of open up to you some of the challenges that higher education, and particularly geoscience in higher education, is facing in the UK. But I think that many of these issues that I raise, and many of the questions that I'll raise, will be pertinent to similar economies around the world. So I'm going to focus on three things. Firstly, and this isn't semantics, I'm an academic, I could go into a semantic argument about geoscience. What do we mean by the future role of geoscientists? And does what my membership understand by that differ from what you think by that term? Then something about supply and demand and the geoscientist pipeline from pre-university to you, post-university. And then some thoughts really about the future direction of geoscience degree courses. So, addressing that first one, what do we mean by geoscience? Well, in the UK we have a system where students all apply through a central admissions service called UCAS, and if I type into UCAS the term geoscience, it comes up with 23 courses at 9 UK universities. And I think tellingly, almost all of those have some caveat associated with them linked to environmental. So the term geoscience, in terms of advertising it to potential students in the UK, seems to link it to environmental. However, in that search engine, it does give you a range of other options. So these are other terms that are broadly under the umbrella of geoscience. And in asking our membership what they thought of as geoscience, don't worry about the details here, but this basically shows what their responses were. Effectively, they thought it was geology or potentially geochemistry and geophysics. So if I type in geology into the search engine, this much better reflects what universities in the UK are actually doing. There are 256 courses at 42 UK universities. So geoscience to the university sector in the UK means geology. And so the question I ask you is, do we really mean geology or do we mean something else? If we mean geology, in changing the skill sets, do we change the unique position of geology? Do we lose its distinctiveness? I'm thinking increasing social science in a geoscience degree. How does that then differ from something like physical geography? So, what is the distinctiveness of a geoscience degree if we mean geology? And if we mean something different, what do we mean? And I think our members are slightly confused by that. So given that most degrees in the UK are geology degrees, what are the sorts of things that currently influence the design of those geology degrees? Well, there's some regulatory things in the UK that constrain the design of geology degrees. So there's professional accreditation. the vast majority of those 240-odd degree courses seek and obtain professional accreditation through the Geological Society of London, and that has certain requirements associated with it. You must do X hours of Y hours of something else, 60 days field work. Some of that's good, potentially, some of it maybe not so good. We're also subject to governmental oversight, so we have something called subject benchmarks, which again specify for a geology degree you must have cover these subjects and these skill sets, and that is monitored by something called the Quality Assurance Agency, although that's now become a little bit defunct and we're not quite sure of the status of those subject benchmarks. But most degrees abide by those benchmark statements. And increasingly, we are being regulated through national performance indicators. So we have something called the Teaching Excellence Framework, which looks at student satisfaction and a whole range of student-centered measures that start influencing the way we design our degree courses. You don't put on courses that students don't like because you get hammered in the national survey. And that's now regulated by a new body called the Office for Students, putting the power in the hands of the students. Clearly, we want to develop relevant professional and workplace skills, and that's where we need to reach out to you and make sure that they are relevant. Cost. Of course, cost is a key limiting factor in the design of most geoscience curricula, and particularly fieldwork. Fieldwork is a premium offer from geoscience departments. It costs a lot of money. Universities scrutinize it to the nth degree because it costs so much. So we need to make sure that that fieldwork is the right type of fieldwork. It's delivering the right sort of skill sets for the students, for the sorts of graduates that you want. And similarly, IT. I heard this morning session talking about data and big data. We get free databases, we get free software, but we don't necessarily have the supporting infrastructure behind that because that's costly as well. And there are some just practical constraints that have changed since I went through as an undergraduate X years ago. Typically, we teach in modules. So that might be 3 or 4 modules per week. So a module would be something like mineralogy or crystallography. But they have constraints on them, the amount of hours that we can actually teach, the amount of contact with a member of staff. And typically for geoscience degrees, it's between 15 and 18 hours a week, half a working week. So the more we want to introduce, the more we have to be mindful that we probably have to take some things out of the curriculum. So let's think about the supply and demand side, the pipeline. And I'm going to focus on really just on undergraduate courses. I think John will say something more about postgraduate courses later. But we recruit almost uniquely in the UK from high school, from A-level students who have done higher qualifications, typically physics, maths, biology, chemistry, geology is one of those qualifications. So we need to make sure that we're attractive to those students, otherwise we don't get them. And an increasing element of this is employability, not from necessarily just the perspective of the employer, but from the perspective of the government and the students themselves. They're paying for their education now. The government is telling them that they should be able to demand a return on that investment. So, focusing in on supply a little bit more, given that most geology degrees draw from this pool of 18-year-olds who are just coming out of high school, we know that we're in a demographic dip at the moment. So this shows the trend of 18-year-olds who are available to universities generally in the UK. And there's been about a 6.4% decrease. And that's hit university budgets. We're not getting the money that we used to get. But that's a known phenomenon. We planned for that in many cases, and we're due to come out of it next year. So there'll be an upturn. There'll be a delay in that actually feeding through into university courses. But the future looks relatively bright in that sense. We're bottomed out. But if I show you the same curve for geoscience, we can see that since 2015, the same period as the demographic dip, there has been a decline. If I put the percentages on that, you can see it way outpaces the 6.4% that we would expect if we were just in line with the demographic dip. Geoscience courses in the UK are becoming less attractive to students for whatever reason. And if we look at the present number there, so about 6,000 applications, this is the total number of applications. Each student can apply for 5 universities, so divide that by 5, and you'll see it, basically, we convert every applicant into a student who comes to university. We're not turning people away. Every student who applies to a geoscience course is pretty much getting a place somewhere. Looking at that in terms of what is driving that, then I was taught that there was a link between the dollar barrel, the price of the dollar barrel, and student numbers at university. So that's the dotted green curve there. And what we can see there is that, well, you could argue that at the peak of oil price, there was a slight lag, but then a peak in geology enrolments. But there's a much clearer link to the blue curve, which is the number of A-level geology students, and that is in terminal decline. We are losing geology as an A-level subject in this country, so they're not getting exposed to geology at high school. So in answer, are geoscience degrees attractive to students in the present form? We've got an image problem. I won't labour that point. And we've also got criticism in terms of our employability. The number of graduates going into employment, particularly in the geoscience sector, is a focus of government attention. So the Wakeham report in 2016 specifically criticised geoscience as not having the right sort of employment uptake. Okay, so quickly to run through some questions that will hopefully promote some discussion in the panel and in the remainder of the afternoon. Do we understand the future demand? Well, we don't understand what's happening in schools, except that we know we're losing the visibility of geoscience through the A-level. What's happening in the traditional geoscience industry? We need to know, we need to understand what you need us to change in order to refresh the curriculum and make it more attractive to students. Academia, well, we should know what's going on in academia because we're in it, but the research landscape has changed. It's more difficult for us to get fundamental geology funded for PhD studentships. A lot of the calls for funding for PhD are, with some notable exceptions, are around multidisciplinary, climate change, things like that. They're more attractive, both to the student and to the funders. And so future trends, well, my kids are increasingly concerned about doing something about some of the issues of, for example, climate change, rather than, they're convinced that it's happening, so we don't need to keep telling them that. Now they want to know what we're going to do about it. So how do we build that in? What are the new opportunities in industry? We're poorly represented in things like renewables, generally speaking. It's very poorly represented in the geoscience curriculum. And what about non-geoscience careers? Geology should lend itself to graduates getting a range of other employment, or going into a range of other employment types as well. And so I'll probably finish here. I think Peter's given me the nod to finish. I'll finish here and say, well, how can we be distinctive and relevant? How can we make geology both distinctive so it doesn't blur into environmental science and geography, and yet still be seen as relevant to the student population? Okay, thank you.